Welcome to Pay Attention, interviews about truth in troubling times. And today, my guest, I'm very happy to say, is Dr. Dan Siegel. And Dan Siegel, MD, is clinical professor of psychiatry at UCLA School of Medicine and the founding co-director of the Mindful Awareness Research Center at UCLA. An educator, Dan is a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association and the recipient of several honorary fellowships. He's also the executive director of the Mindsight Institute, an educational organization which offers online learning and in-person seminars that focus on how the development of mindfulness in individuals, families, and communities can be enhanced by examining the interface of human relationships and basic biological processes. His psychotherapy practice includes children, adolescents, adults, couples, and families. And he serves as the medical director of the Lifespan Learning Institute. And he's on the advisory board of the Blue School in New York City, which has its curriculum built around Dr. Siegel's Mindsight approach. Dan Siegel is also on the board of trustees at the Garrison Institute. Dr. Siegel has published extensively for both professional and popular audiences. He's the author of numerous articles, chapters, and I believe 15 books, including The Developing Mind, How Relationships and the Brain Interact to Shape Who We Are. And his most recent books are those that we'll be speaking about today, or sort of speaking around or from. Brainstorm, The Power and Purpose of the Teenage Brain, The Whole Brain Child, and Parenting from Inside Out. Dan Siegel is also highly regarded in the field of mindfulness, and he has himself developed a field of interpersonal neurobiology, which is a view of our interactive and interpersonal life that draws on over a dozen branches of science to create a framework for understanding subjective and intersubjective experiences. I know Dan as a friend and a colleague, and I know him to be generous, accessible, and deeply committed to helping parents and children and all of us to enter into a full range of life's challenges with greater awareness and courage. And so I'm so happy to have you today, Dan, on Pay Attention, where I hope to be talking with you especially about parenting adolescent children at home during this time of COVID, and also about just the general framework that you bring to every inquiry, which includes mindfulness and a lot of neurobiology. So welcome, and thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Polly. It's an honor to be here with you. And I really am grateful for this chance to connect with you and then to talk about these very important and timely issues.
And while we're kind of introducing, I think it might be good to tell listeners about how you work with your own biology by walking through interviews.
That's right. You know, years ago, as a writer, I was just finding myself sitting too much, and when we realized sitting was thought of as the new smoking, I tried to figure out what am I going to do, because as a therapist like you know, I sit also with my patients, my clients, and anyway, so I came across this walking desk with a super slow treadmill underneath a desk that's kind of built into it. So I do everything now since the pandemic started, so much on the screen, you know, not just writing, but now seeing clients and teaching, and having meetings, and, you know, so I do it on this walking desk. So you'll see me move a little bit. I'm walking unbelievably slowly, so a lot of people don't even know. So I'm actually walking right now. I mean, you can tell it when I go, this is how fast I'm walking. Very slow. But anyway, so if it bothers you, just turn my face off, whatever. But it's actually, I need it for my body. I just can't sit anymore. I've too many years as a therapist, it's just sitting. So I really need to move. So that's my biology needs.
Yeah, actually, I think it looks like it looks like fun. I mean, I'm feeling a little jealous that I'm not walking actually,
Well,
but
come on, Polly, just walk with
yeah, I
me.
can I better walk. Yeah, I'd have to walk around the room. So this is a good way to segue into your own background because I don't know your background, and I wondered what about your background brought you to the dedication to parents and children, especially from the perspective of mindfulness. I kind of remember meeting you, I think, pretty much after The Developing Brain had just come out. And at that point, I could see that you had already entered into mindfulness and some practice and some inquiry. So I wonder what brought you to integrate, especially dedication to families, children, and parents, and to integrate that with mindfulness.
Yeah. Well, it's a great question, Polly, but it may not be as direct a link as one might think. I mean, so just to start with the personal side,
Right.
I had two very intellectual parents, and when I went into college, I was really fascinated with life, and learned biochemistry was my major. So I was in the Department of Biology, studying how chemicals form life, and just as a strange uh, aside, I saw on like a telephone pole, at the school, it said, do you want to work on a suicide prevention service?
Hmm.
And something about that just was like intriguing to me. So I signed up to be like a person on the phone, answering crisis calls. And so at night, I'd work on the suicide prevention service. And during the day, I'd be, studying enzymes and, all the intellectual stuff of molecules. So there was something about that experience as an adolescent, because adolescence is a period that goes essentially from, after the first dozen years or so of childhood, you then have this period of the second dozen years of life, even a little more into the mid to late 20s. Adolescence goes. We can talk about what that is, but I was absolutely, in the middle of my adolescence as a college student. So this is really affecting me, and having these two worlds of, enzymes on the one hand and emotions and emotional communication on the other was like mind expanding and mind boggling. Like, what does it mean if someone is feeling so much despair? They're feeling like, I can't live anymore. I'm going to end my life, but I'll try one more time. I'm on the phone with the suicide service. And then you, as the receiver of the call, need to really tune into the subjective experience of that person. And the way you communicate could make the difference, whether they pull the trigger or they don't.
Mhm.
It was that serious. And so as an adolescent, it taught me, that our inner mental life is literally a matter of life and death, and how we communicate with it, and whether we can really reach to authentically join with someone at their level of suffering could make a difference, whether they literally make the decision to end their life. And I'll just say this, that a dear friend of mine just ended his life last week. So so the topic of suicide is actually, this is the first person in my life, my friend, or in my social circles that I knew closely, who died from suicide. And anyway, so it's a weird thing to start with, but these days, with the suicide rates going up,
Yes.
with depression,
Yes.
anxiety going up, with people's isolation going up, this is probably a relevant way to say, as an adolescent, this is what began my journey. So when I chose to go to medical school, I actually somehow had a dream of becoming a pediatrician, where I'd take care of children, because I love kids and adolescents. And, I'd been a counselor at camp and all that kind of stuff. And so I figured, I'd take my love of biology and my love of people and my love of kids, and it'd be really natural to become, a specialist in childhood medicine, pediatrics. So, but in the course of medical school, and I'm saying this to you because without this background, I don't think it would be a fair way to answer your question. But
Right.
I found that the professors I had, didn't focus on the inner mental life of their patients. So they could tell someone they were dying and walk away. And
Yeah.
I would pull on their white coats and I would say, don't you want to talk to them about how they feel? And literally these professors of medicine would say to me, why would I do that?
Hmm.
And I go, well, you just told them they're dying. And they go, but there's nothing more for me to do.
Right.
And I say, yeah, but you could talk about how they feel about what you just told them. And they'd say, go away, kid, you're from California,
Mhm.
because I was in school in Boston. And it was like, they would relegate emotions to some California, beach boy kind of thing. And so anyway, I ended up dropping out of school
Hmm.
because that kind of thing happened so often that I didn't want to become a kind of professional who denied the reality of the inner mental life that we all have, or at least I thought we had when I was coming from California. So, it was very strange to actually
Hmm.
meet super smart, scientifically informed physicians, my professors of medicine, who were so robotic. It was actually terrifying. So
Yeah.
I went on a journey. I was going to do other things. I thought about being a dancer and all sorts of other things. But the bottom line is, when I realized I really was fascinated what the mind was, before I chose to go back to school, I made up this word called mind sight, which
Hmm.
is basically, our ability to perceive the inner subjective life of both other people and of ourselves. So like on a suicide prevention service, it would be the perceptual system you would use when the person is calling saying, I can't stand it anymore, or can't stand it anymore, I'm going to overdose, or I have a gun, or I'm going to end my life. Beneath those words and even their tone of voice is a subjective texture of their despair, of their feeling like there's no future, hopelessness, right? Feeling that they
Mhm.
can't do anything to make things better. They're helpless. And that hopelessness and helplessness and despair, when you join with that, because you've
Right.
identified the mental state, you use something to perceive that. So I just made up the word mindsight. And so when I went back to school, I was almost like an anthropologist, because of course the professors hadn't changed, but I
Mhm.
had. Now
Mhm.
I had the tool of mindsight to name it so I could see it and see when it was missing. And I noticed that the professors who seemed to have mindsight had patients who did better. And those who
Mhm.
didn't had patients who were disconnected. So ultimately I did go into pediatrics, and I just was so fascinated with this mindsight business that I transferred over to psychiatry. And, the field of psychiatry wasn't so interested in mindsight as, classifying people with disorders. And,
Right.
this was in the early 1980s. So everything was like, oh, aren't medications so cool? And I thought, well,
Yeah.
medications can be helpful for sure. They can save lives. Absolutely. And that doesn't make the mind any less important,
Yeah.
So this became part of a journey for me. So to rev it a little up faster, I met a woman who became my wife,
Yes.
Caroline, and she was a meditator, right?
Oh.
And I was not a meditator. Okay, so she'd been meditating from the early 70s. She learned in a Zen monastery in Japan, right? And then
Mm.
when we met, she was a lawyer, and I was a physician, and she did her meditation every morning. And I just thought it was one of those quirky things that, someone you're in love with, they just do and you just ignore it. That's how naive I was. And I had an eye problem. So I really wasn't that expansive in my ability to read until my eyes got fixed up, years and years later. But so I wasn't scholarly about, oh, there's this whole field called mindfulness or meditation.
Mhm.
I just
Mhm.
would literally ignore what you would do. It's I'm embarrassed to say it, but when I went on this, I became a researcher and then ultimately left the university because it was I felt reductionistic about
Mhm.
expecting the professors to just reduce people to categories and give them certain medications. I had a much different sense of things. So I just became a private practicing therapist, which I loved, although I wish I would have had a walking desk and did walking therapy. But I was sitting. But then what happened was it was the decade of the brain, and I had when I had been in academics, I had brought all these different scientists together to ask what is the connection of the mind and the brain. This is 1992, and those 40 scientists, really struggled to find what they meant by the word mind. And so ultimately I had to give them a definition where the anthropologists in the room could somehow find a way to talk to the neuroscientists or the geneticists. Anyway, so that journey started this field back in 1992 called interpersonal neurobiology, which is
Can you say what is the definition of mind that you use? I'm curious. I'm curious about a number of things you've said, but that one I'd like to hear if we can right now.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to tell you it, but I just want to make sure this is, believe it or not, is a trail leading to. Let me finish the first question, then I'll come to the second question.
Okay.
So the field began in 1992. I dropped out of the university, and Caroline said to me, instead of always changing fields, I dropped out of medical school, then left pediatrics, and now I said I'm not going to do this academic psychiatry anymore. She goes, instead of changing fields, she goes, why don't you just change the field? And I said, oh, wow, that's so interesting. Of course, a mindfulness practitioner would say something like that. So I said, that's so interesting, because the field doesn't seem to have a definition of what it's doing. It's called the field of mental health, but actually mental health practitioners are never told what the mental is or the health is. Right. So anyway, we'll get to that later. So then I wrote this book, The Developing Mind, to try to articulate and publish, this view of mind. We'll get to in the next question. But once I published that book, my daughter was in preschool, and her preschool director heard about the book, and she said, why don't you teach this Developing Mind, textbook, as a graduate school textbook, to the parents and to the teachers of the school. So I said, okay. So she sat in on the classes, and she said, I've been a preschool director for 30 years, and I don't know anything about the brain. But your Developing Mind stuff of showing what is the connection of mind and brain, it's what I've been teaching for 30 years. So why don't we do something together? So I said, okay, that sounds fun. And so we started teaching these workshops for parents. And when we ultimately were encouraged by the parents to turn the workshop into a book, we called it Parenting from the Inside Out. And it took this one finding from the research I was trained to do, attachment research, which was your self-understanding is the best predictor of if your child has a secure attachment to you. And attachment isn't everything by any means. There's the environment, there's the culture, there's all sorts of things, but it's one part of our lives. And, what's interesting about that is the attachment research world knew nothing of the whole field of mindfulness, but the criteria for making sense of your life, it turns out, overlap with the mindfulness stuff. That I learned years later. Anyway, so we write this book, and we're finishing in this very room. Mary Hartzell and I, that's the preschool director, she and I are typing out this book. And we said, okay, let's make this really accessible. So if you had to summarize our fundamental principle, what is it? We said, well, you should be intentional in how you are a parent. You should be like awake and conscientious. You should care. You should be compassionate. You should, really be really aware of what's happening as it's happening. So we said, well, is there a word that captures all that stuff? So we said, why don't we say you should be mindful? And we go, that sounds like a cool word. Okay, so we put it in the book. Neither of us were meditators. Neither of us heard of mindfulness meditation. And we put it in the book. And the book comes out in 2003, which is a little bit before you and I met. Right. And then we were teaching workshops from the book. People would read the book and they would say, well, we're in this workshop, but when are you going to teach us to meditate? And Mary and I looked at each other. We go, what are they talking about? Why meditate? What is this meditation thing? We're already saying some pretty weird things, like the mind is not the same as the brain. Now you want us to meditate? Oh my God. What do you mean? So then right after that, and this is a really sad thing to say, so I got to take a moment. But I get a phone call from my friend, who is the one who just ended his life.
Oh.
This is now back in 2004.
Mm-hmm.
And he calls me and he says, I want you to come do the keynote presentation of this big psychotherapy conference with this fellow named Jon Kabat-Zinn. So I go, well, who's he? And he goes, well, he does this thing called mindfulness. And Mary Hartzell and I had been doing these workshops with people doing the mindfulness thing, the mindfulness meditation. So I go, oh my God, Rich, I said, you're now the second person who's telling me, what about this mindfulness meditation thing? I better learn something about it. So I read all about John had, like, I think at that time, 2 books and maybe 2 papers of Richie Davidson. So I read his books and I read the 2 papers in those days. This is now 2004, probably 3, 4, something.
Was Full Catastrophe Living out that?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that was out, I think, in 98 or something like that. And it was also, what was the other book? It was Wherever You Go, There You Are.
Go, There You Are. Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful books. So I'm so excited to meet him. So I get on the stage with John. You can listen to if you ever want to, it's hilarious. It's almost like a comedy. There's this audio of this meeting where it's Diane Ackerman and Jon Kabat-Zinn and me. We also did something with a poet named John O'Donohue. And so who I had brought there. And so I say to Jon Kabat-Zinn, I said, we just used this word mindfulness by accident in a book, but I read your mindfulness research. And what's really strange about it is your outcome measures that you found with Richard Davidson are almost identical to the outcome measures we have in my field called attachment research, where it's almost like secure attachment between a parent and a child is an attunement that leads to some kind of resonance of 2 beings into one. And I don't know how it relates to sitting on a cushion meditating, because I've never meditated before, I said to him, but I said, but it feels almost like, from what I read in your books, that it's some kind of internal attunement or something. And here are the outcomes for secure attachment, and it relates to parts of the brain that become very integrated, differentiated parts become linked. And I go, I would bet you if someone ever looks in the brain, which no one had at that time, of mindfulness researchers, you'll find the brain becomes more integrated. And then I listened to this audio. It's the funniest thing in the world. He goes, you don't know anything about mindfulness. I said, it's true. I know absolutely nothing. He goes, well, go meditate. I said, fine. How do I do that? So he sends me to a week-long silent retreat in Barre, Massachusetts. And I don't know if you and I met, Polly, right before that or right after that, but it was around that time.
Yeah, it was around that time, because it was also sort of clear that you didn't know much about meditating.
Nothing. I knew nothing about meditation, except my wife did this quirky thing.
Yeah. So you followed a path that kind of came from the other side of the page. It didn't come from the side of the page that involved. I mean, a lot of people do first come to something like, psychology or investigation of the mind, and then they go into meditate, and then they bring the 2 together. I came more from the meditation side. I started in Zen Buddhism with Jon Kabat-Zinn's teacher. Philip Kapleau was my first teacher. And John started also at Rochester Zen Center. So I started in the subjective investigation through Zen meditation, and I gradually came around to the idea that I needed psychotherapy. I needed to talk to somebody. And then I went from my own therapy into becoming a psychologist and then becoming a psychoanalyst. So it's interesting. I think you came more from the sort of biology, and even maybe biology into attachment and intersubjectivity, and then into the idea of paying close attention. And paying close attention in a particular way actually leads to a deep change in experience, whether it's interpersonal or even subjective.
Right.
But I think I want to come back to your definition of mind only because of this one thing. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I just ask you one question first?
Mm-hmm.
What was that like for you to combine the deep meditation background with becoming a therapist, those two worlds. How was that for you to combine them?
Well, I would say that it was kind of lonely because nobody else was actually doing it. So, when I was in graduate school, and then I became an academic for 10 years, I taught at Bryn Mawr College. So I was in graduate school at Washington University. And so I was kind of like your wife. I sort of hid all of this in the closet, and didn't tell people that I had taken vows to be a bodhisattva. I mean, it just wouldn't have fitted into the conversation. And so I sort of left it on its own, and didn't really bring it into any formal conversation about anything until when I was at Bryn Mawr in the mid 80s or the late 80s. His Holiness the Dalai Lama began to make all of this palatable to the general public. And by that time, I was in a kind of deep conversation at Bryn Mawr with some people at Bryn Mawr and Haverford, where we were looking at hermeneutics and interpretation. We were looking at, European philosophy as well as development. And I said, I think I'm going to bring this conversation into the mix. I'm going to say, by the way, I've been a Zen practitioner since I was 22, and I was in my 30s then. And I began to talk about it then, but it was mostly, I kept it hidden because, as you said, if you're in a serious academic field, and particularly in the mental health area, you were not meant to actually have any spiritual ideas at all, or at least not in any way that you would tell people about them, because that would have really called into question a lot of the research I was doing. So I also, though, came into what's called constructivism, that way of thinking about psychology, and I was a developmentalist, Piagetian, neo-Piagetian. And so there was a way that I could cast some of my ideas about, the way we perceive what we call reality in this framework of constructivism. So it was interesting because I came early to the meditation side and then a little later to the academic side, but they weren't together. And Jon Kabat-Zinn, of course, was one of those people that brought them together.
Mm-hmm.
But even then, his work on mindfulness-based stress reduction really didn't come out into, let's say, the academic framework for quite a while. I mean, it really was more late 80s, early 90s, and the 90s being the decade of the brain. I got so tired of talking about serotonin with people, and just that whole sort of conversation seemed to me to be overly literal. It was like, come on, guys, the best way to operate on a brain is talk to it. And, I said that many times, but it wasn't possible to bring all of this together really for quite a long time. And
I love that. I love that. It's so interesting, Polly, because Caroline Welch, my wife, she has a background in not only meditation, but law, but she just wrote a book called The Gift of Presence. And she interviewed 100 women, more than 100 women, to see how did mindfulness become a part of their life. And I'll have her get in touch with you, because I think it's such an interesting thing to see how journeys. She wanted to really do this kind of mindfulness guide for women, but I think it's got this universal appeal, the book, but also the journey you're describing is so interesting, where you had to split any interest in kind of subjective life and then what might be interpreted as spiritual. And you mentioned that word, and we should really, it helped me to know what you mean by that word, because in my family, we never used that word. If you used anything like that word, you were kicked out of the house. And then in my education as a scientist, there was nothing like that. And then even I went to a very, science-based medical school. So no one talked about love or, larger connections or nothing like that. Not even the mind and your feelings. If someone told you were dying, I mean, it was like bizarre. And so this was, part of the problem of the decade of the brain that I think is that people equated, like Hippocrates did, mind with simply brain activity.
Yes.
Which would have meant that if I were an adolescent on that suicide prevention service, if that were totally true, and the person calls and says, I'm feeling so much despair, and I were to say something like, oh, your serotonin must be so low in your prefrontal cortex, they would kill themselves.
Right.
Because even if it were just dependent on serotonin levels, even if that were true, which is probably much more complex than that, but it doesn't make subjective experience the same as brain firing.
No.
And this is a confusion, I think, and it, at least in terms of the mind, and your question about what is the mind, the word mind is not in every language,
right?
Believe it or not, but in those languages that do have it, like ours in English, people often use that word to mean subjective experience. So as a starting place, you say, well, what's that? Well, that's the felt texture of life as it's being lived. Then you go, well, how do you know you have subjective experience? Well, then you come to the second aspect of mind, which is consciousness. The only way you know you're having subjective experience is that you're aware of it, right? And you're paying attention, which is a little different than awareness, but you're paying what's called focal attention. Attention is the direction of energy and information flow, really. And then your awareness of that is called focal attention. So then you go, okay, well, I have consciousness, but what am I conscious of? Well, then you get to a third facet of mind. You go, well, you have information. Like I say, hello, Polly, and you say, hello, Dan. The hellos are a form of information of greeting, right? So you go, okay, big deal. Psychology has been talking about this forever, subjective experience, even though my understanding from my colleagues in psychology is at the turn of the last century, there was a decision made in academics not to pay attention to subjective experience because you couldn't objectively measure
investigate it. Right. Exactly.
And I was like going, whoa, but then it reminded me of my trauma of medical school. Like, wow, because medicine sort of did that too. You ignore subjective experience, that's not good for anybody, but that's apparently intentionally done. So then you say, okay, well, those three things are fine. And I was in the room with the 40 scientists. We said, what's the relationship between mind and brain? Everyone pretty much agrees on what the mind refers to, not what it is, but it refers to these three things: subjective experience, consciousness, information processing, right? So the scientists in the room couldn't agree how those things were any different for a neuroscientist from the brain, but an anthropologist in the room, she would say, it's not the brain, it's what happens in culture. And then the sociologist would say, it's not the brain, it's what happens in groups. And then for me, as an attachment researcher, and a therapist, I would say, it's what happens in the dyad. It's this relational field that's created. And the neuroscientists and some of the psychologists and psychiatrists in the room, they would say, hooey, you're reversing science. Mind is just brain. And Hippocrates said that 2,500 years ago. William James, the grandfather of modern psychology, he said it in 1890 in the Principles of Psychology, and so I said, well, maybe that's the end of it. Let's get rid of the word mind. If mind is just a synonym for brain activity, let's see if you could just say the phrase brain activity every time you had something on your mind. So you'd say, it's on my brain activity, and then someone calls and says, I'm feeling despair. You go, oh, your brain activity is just low serotonin.
Yeah.
It's just not the same. So anyway, besides those three facets of mind, here's the definition. This gets to your second question, that for me was kind of like I was the person who invited these 40 scientists into this one room. And we met once, and no one could agree on what the mind was. Everyone could say what the brain was. So there wasn't going to be a second meeting based on how people were interacting with each other. And I said, can you come one more time? Just one more time. That's all I'm asking you to do. Everyone came this time, one more time. They said, okay. So we planned the meeting for the next week. And I take myself for a walk and I'm going, how in the world could you get an anthropologist and sociologist and linguist to have a respectful conversation with a geneticist or a neuroscientist that are in the room too, 40 academics, right?
Mm.
So I'm walking along the beach and I'm going, what does an anthropologist study in culture that a sociologist studies in groups, that a linguist studies in language use, that a neuroscientist studies when they try to look at the brain? In those days, we were mostly PET scans, but just imagining, brain functioning and, what's actually going on there. So I had been trained in neuroscience by a fellow named David Hubel. And David Hubel was a professor in the medical school, got the Nobel Prize when I was there,
Right.
for showing how the kind of light that you expose to growing animals affects the structure of their brain. So, as I'm walking along the beach and I'm going, well, David studied, the impact of light on the brain. And here I am at the beach seeing these waves crash on the shore. And if an academic forced me to study the water or study the sand, I would miss the coast. What if it were both, right? What if the coast were both? And even if a university made you choose one or the other to study and become a sandologist or a waterologist, you'd miss the big picture, which is the coast needs both. So I said, what if the mind is both? But academia has been forcing us to split them apart. What is the anthropologist studying and the neuroscientist studying that's the same thing? So I'm walking along, and I look at this wave way out, like 200 yards away. Then this big wave is coming. It's now 100 yards away, and it's 50 yards away. Now it's 20 yards away, 10 yards away, 5 yards away, and then it's crashing at my feet. And I'm sitting, I'm not standing, I'm standing there going, what just happened? Did I see matter coming from 200 yards and crashing my feet? No, I didn't. I saw energy. I saw an energy wave that pushed molecules 200 yards out. But what's crashing on my feet here are not the molecules that were going up and down 200 yards away. It's the energy. So then I go, oh my God, that's what the brain is all about. It's about electrochemical energy flow that goes in certain patterns. And that's what an anthropologist studies in culture, is basically the forms of communication that are energy and information flow patterns. And that's what a sociologist studies. And then I went through every one of the disciplines and I said, oh my God, I'm an attachment researcher. No one talks like this, but basically what I've been doing all these years is studying energy and information sharing patterns between a baby and a caregiver. So I said, wow. So skull nor skin block that flow. So that's the confusion, is people think the skin bag around us is some kind of defining boundary.
Right.
That's probably the intellectual error. So I go, okay, well, then what would the system be if it were energy and information flow? And I was sitting in this very room reading a math book on systems, and it has these 3 criteria that make it a complex system. So it's open to influences from outside of itself. It's capable of being chaotic, and it's nonlinear, meaning a small input leads to large and hard to predict results. Anyway, if you're a complex system, you have something called emergence. Yeah. Emergence is where the elements of the system interact and give rise to something larger. So the first thought I had was maybe subjective experience, consciousness, and information processing are all emergent aspects of energy and information flow, whether it's embodied or relational. And then I thought, well, but that doesn't help us with the mental health thing. That may describe the mind, that's fine. But what would the mind be in terms of mental health? And then I was reading further in this math book, and it said that complex systems have self-organizing emergent properties that basically differentiate and link so that it optimizes self-organization. And when the system is optimizing self-organization, basically it's in harmony. And when it isn't, it goes to chaos or rigidity. And then I read that in the math book right here, and I go, oh my God, that's what I've been noticing in every one of my patients, that no matter what their diagnostic category you have to put down for insurance reasons, they have chaos or rigidity, everybody, or some combination, whether it's
Mhm.
trauma or manic depressive illness or
Mhm.
schizophrenia or whatever. You can go through the whole DSM. And then I thought, oh my God. So here's the definition I came back the next week to offer to the 40 people, that the mind, beyond the three facets of subjective experience, consciousness, and information processing, a fourth facet, which is a definition, is the emergent, self-organizing, embodied and relational, so it's within and between, process that's regulating energy and information flow. And then you say a healthy mind, from that definition, is a mind that's optimizing self-organization by promoting the differentiation of aspects of itself and the linkage. And there's no name in math for that, so I just use the name integration, but you could call it Lulu or Wawa or whatever you want to call it.
Mhm.
But it's the idea is you have differentiation plus linkage, and in the linkage you don't lose the differentiated qualities.
Right.
And
Right.
that, so far, that was from 1992. That definition, the group met again, 100% vote we could go with that. And the group met for 4.5 years. The field of interpersonal neurobiology was born to say, let's draw on the wisdom of all the different disciplines and find what E.O. Wilson later would call consilience, the common ground across disciplines. And so far, if you read The Developing Mind, the third edition, which is somewhere around here, you'll see that proposal predicted research outcomes. So it turns out to be true. Mindfulness training, which we can talk about, integrates the brain. Mindfulness training leads to integration in relationships. And there's all these exciting things where an integrated brain is the number one predictor of all aspects of well-being you can find. So I can talk to you about all that research, but basically that's the definition. That gets to your second question. That was the
Well,
longest answer.
it's pretty close to the definition of life, though. The definition of mind, as you gave it, a self-organizing system that's closed, that's differentiated, that it requires a sort of homeostasis or balance. And it sort of reminded me in the mid 80s of working with Maturana and Varela. They were at that point involved in cybernetics. But there are several things you said that I think are interesting and important, and will lead us eventually back to adolescence too. But that in in first investigating from a meditation side of things, I went into that practice specifically because I grew up with a lot of domestic violence in a very poor family from the point of view of my father was a factory worker, and there were a lot of issues that were undermining the stability of our family, the extended family, and my immediate family. And so I became interested quite young in mental illness, just what I saw around me, but specifically in the issue of suffering, that people just didn't talk about it. It seemed to me that there was a lot of suffering in the world that I was waking up to, but there was no conversation about it. And Buddhism has a big conversation about suffering. And, it was very clear to me from the beginning that, the Buddha, the very first thing he says after he awakens is, there's suffering. What he means is basically this world is this dukkha, this kind of quality. But moving then through those Buddhist ideas early in my life, I came to find out that in Japanese, and I'm not a Japanese speaker, but I have a couple of friends who are translators, that mind is translated more or less as heart. And so in many of the Buddhist texts, particularly the sort of more Far Eastern texts, the ones that are connected to China, the mind and the heart are differentiated, and the mind is more in the solar plexus than it is in the brain, and so that sense that it exists outside of yourself, you make connections with others, you don't have it inside of yourself. You reach mind in that way. It's like language and culture and secure attachment and as you say, the transfer of energy and so on. You reach it by making those connections, not by some other means. And so I had come across that whole kind of conversation before I got into the decade of the brain. And then it started to seem like a really big mistake that people were going to think that the mind was in here, and because it really didn't make sense. You could see developmentally that from a Piagetian point of view, how does the child organize its sensory motor environment by interacting with pushing and pulling and grasping and then, communicating and so on. That's the way it organizes that sense of I have a mind or whatever you want to call it. I can perceive things because humans don't just perceive. We're not just sentient. We know that we know, or we know that we feel, or that we know that we think. That loop is part of the way we humans actually deal with mind. But it took a long time in my own life of going through a lot of academic institutions and environments, and I did eventually leave academia also for similar reasons. I just saw that the conversation wasn't going anywhere. I mean, it wasn't going to go further than what it was at that point. That I came around to the understanding that you can't separate out relationships, attachment, conversation, language from mind. I mean, it's not that the mind is your serotonin level or that it is actually even necessarily reflected in your serotonin level, because I think now we know pretty much that depression really relates to serotonin levels pretty infrequently rather than frequently. But it's interesting to me, and it's still interesting because when people come to therapy, they often say, my brain instead of my mind now. There's something in my brain, or there's some way that my brain is. And as we go on in the conversation, it's generally a habit of the mind. And who knows what it has to do with the brain, but the ordinary person now, having been affected by the conversations about brain, having been affected by the conversations about medications and, whether or not there is some sort of genetic or physical component to the depression or the anxiety and so on, ordinary people don't say my mind typically, they say my brain, or they say something is wrong with my brain. Mm-hmm. And that's, to me, a big change from the way I remember things being, when I was young, or even in young adulthood. And even when I first started practicing psychotherapy, which was, I was in my internship in the late 70s, a long time ago. People didn't come in with a question about a diagnosis like, do I have ADD? Or, do you think I'm depressed? They would come in with an existential problem. Mm-hmm. Like, I can't seem to do this or that, or I find I'm always my own worst enemy, or, there was a kind of a description of an experience or a kind of existential issue. Yeah. And now that whole conversation has really switched to my brain and something wrong with it. And,
And there's some, this is a great conversation because when we get into the adolescent story, mm-hmm. Brain is helpful. Right. But let's do a little exercise even right now, Polly. There's, there are these regions of the brain that when talking to another person are trying to detect where that person's eyes are focused. So I do this exercise with my patients when we're doing all these calls or FaceTime, is I make sure that their head is right near their camera, and they put my head near the camera. So when they're actually looking at me, mm-hmm. It's almost as if they're looking at my eyes. So like right now, I don't know if you can change your screen, but I've made my screen where your face mm-hmm. is right under my camera, right? So I'm actually looking at your face. And so it probably does it look like I'm looking at you right in the eyes?
Well, actually, because I have on the gallery view, I am looking, so I
Right.
want to
You
spit,
need to
so we switch.
make it,
There you are. There you are.
yeah,
Yes.
make it
Yes. Now,
smaller. But even now, what you can do is make it smaller. So you make your window not fill up the whole thing, so you don't maximize it, and then you drag your thing over, so you're literally right under your camera.
we have kind of an elaborate setup here with the kind of algorithm of everything that Paula is doing.
Okay.
So she said,
All right.
no, I can't switch it.
You can't switch it. All right. So here's
Yes.
what I want to say in terms of like
Yes,
people do
yes.
a lot of Zoom calls
Right.
during this time. You have a part of your brain, which is useful to know about, that says, is this person looking at me in the eyes?
Mhm.
So like, so when you do so much on the screen with the pandemic,
Yes. Yeah.
it's really, really helpful to align your computer system or pad system, your tablet system, so that the person you're looking at, their face, if it's just a one-on-one thing, obviously it's a big group setting, you can't do it. But if it's a one-on-one thing, is as close to your camera as possible. So as you look into their eyes, it's
Mhm.
your eyes are actually looking as close to the camera, or just look straight into the camera. Like right now, Polly, look into your camera, not at me.
Where's my camera at, Paula? I think it's up here in the left top. Yeah. Okay. I'll look at my camera.
Right.
Is it
See,
there?
that gives my body a better feeling.
Yeah.
Because
Okay.
now
So
I feel like you're looking at me, but you can't because the way your setup is. So
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
But I'm
Yes,
looking at you because I rearranged it so your
you
face.
rearranged it so that, yes. Okay.
So that-
So yes, I can't. So yes, we have had difficulties with the eye contact thing since we've set this up, but I'm looking directly at you.
No, I
and
know, but it's not your
but then
camera.
the camera is up there. Yes, I
Yeah.
understand.
So all I'm
So,
saying is
yes.
that here's just one example. I only bring it up
Yes.
because this is one example about the brain.
Yeah.
Like I was seeing a patient, and every time something emotional would happen, he'd look to the side. He'd look to the side, and I thought it was shame. And so I was going to make a shame interpretation. And I realized, oh my God, I don't know where his camera is. So I said to him, and just like you on an iPad, I said, where's your camera? He goes, I have no idea. I said, what are you looking at? He goes, your face.
Yeah.
I said, but is my face near the camera? He goes, is there a camera? I said, yeah, there's a camera. And so we figured it out. So we rearranged his iPad. So now he puts my face just beneath his camera. He can arrange it that way. And his face is right beneath my camera. And now the feeling in our bodies is like we're really getting connected. I'll give you an example. It would be as if I were looking this way.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
You see
yes, yes, yeah.
So there is a brain. I mean, so
Yes.
so I want to really welcome brain science into our discussion because
Yeah.
I think Polly and I would agree with this, but at least I'll say it from my point of view. The brain is fantastic, but it's not the whole story.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you make it the whole story, or if you elevate it too far outside of its position, because it's an organ that's different from the heart, it's different from the lungs, and we have a very different narrative about it. But if you elevate it too high, then you confuse it with the mind, and then it becomes confusing what the mind is. And
Yeah.
I think that's because the mind is inherently relational. And those people who did a lot of meditation a couple thousand years ago recognized that. They recognized that it's not somewhere. It isn't somewhere. It is everywhere.
Well, this is the fascinating thing. Maybe it's a good place to start as we get into adolescence. What was that experience like for you? Because it's a big irony and I have a weird history of this that we can talk to or not talk about, but the big irony is when people sit quietly alone, they realize instead of being alone, they're all one. And it's really kind of an incredible paradox that is so common when you do the deep meditative practice of letting the illusion of a separate self that's kind of rigidified in being more like what a lot of people live, I think, is as a noun, And instead you drop into realizing you're not a separated entity, you know, a noun-like entity. You're more like a massively interconnected verb-like event,
Yes.
right? You're this unfolding process. And so there's a lot of science behind it that I wrote about in a book called Aware. You know, and as you allow yourself to deal with that paradox, I think it's in many ways, you know, a certain layer of that is what the adolescent journey is about. But we can talk about the adolescent business if you want to get into that. But there's so much you and I could talk about
yes.
in terms of mind and all this stuff anyway. But it's totally relevant to what's happening in the pandemic, because, you know, when people use the phrase even, you know, social distancing, I cringe, because even though I know it's an epidemiological term, we should do the exact same recommendations, but change the name to physical distancing.
Yes.
We want to not share our air. We want to really keep physical space, but we want to stay socially connected.
Yes.
So even the phrase, even though it's well intended from epidemiologists, social distancing, it can create anxiety. Oh my God, we're socially distant. Why don't we say we're physically distant, but socially connected?
Yes. You know, that's the first time anyone has said that to me. And I see exactly and precisely what you mean. I mean, because the label social distancing actually interfaces with the experience of being isolated and set apart from others. And that actually is the worst punishment for humans. You know, solitary confinement is much worse than getting beaten if you're in the prison. And people will choose being beaten over solitary confinement because it's painful to be isolated. And so this idea of social distancing, and then also the fact that, you know, and we'll move over to the teenage kind of time, but that special sort of social engagement. I was looking at your acronym ESSENCE, you know, I liked it. But that's the special kind of social engagement that is a part of adolescence and was a part of all of our adolescence, is now being, I would say, distorted by this situation that we're in. And sometimes nobody is talking to kids about that. You know, they don't recognize that they're going through a period of time where their social engagement and their identity formation from peers is a part of the developmental window. And that is actually a kind of, I would say, not exactly what I would call a drive, but it's like a pressure to do that, you know, and they're not allowed to do it in the way that you and I were allowed to do it. And nobody's mentioning that, you know, so it's like the social distancing thing. Nobody mentions that it's really physical distancing and we shouldn't be social distancing. And so there are a lot of confusions that I think come along with this idea that somehow we value the, let's say, issues surrounding physical risk, or let's say, I don't know if value is the right word there, we imbue the physical, biological risks of illness as maybe having a higher status than the risk of losing connection or losing that sort of social link, you know, and especially for developing children. And, you know, maybe there is no remedy on the physical level, but there are remedies in conversation. There are remedies with words. There are different ways of looking so that we can talk to kids and understand more what they're suffering. You know, it's that sense of isolation is something that I think of as one of the greatest sufferings for human beings. And I do think there are many kids, particularly adolescents, because younger kids have different needs from adolescents. And younger kids can play happily around their parents and with their parents, and they may miss their friends. but there are other kinds of things happening developmentally for them than they are happening for kids, like you said, 12 to 28 or whatever, from that long stretch of adolescence.
Mhm.
So I think I do want to segue. I love the conversation we're having, but I did really want to talk particularly about adolescence and parenting adolescents and the kids that are having to stay at home with their parents right now. So where you and I seem to have a strong convergence is around this nature of mind being shared, and that mind is not something that's inside of your head. And there are many cultures that have never actually haven't even imagined that it's inside of your head, and the sense that it comes from language and culture and connection and energies between us does give it a different meaning than the brain. And yet the brain is a wonderful organism and it helps us in lots and lots of ways. But it isn't nearly as, let's say, it's not nearly as, I would say, fascinating as mind, because as fascinating as the brain is, and all these different, capacities and billions of neurons and so on, the mind, because it's so shared, is, to my view anyway, more fascinating because it does have to do with all of the relationships and connections and languages and cultures and so on and so forth, which I feel your work really does make clear, and the way you've put together, science and mindfulness around the interpersonal, intersubjective side of life is really, I think, unique, and I don't know anybody else who does exactly what you do. So maybe we can move then into, with all of your wonderful views and insights, can you tell us what adolescence is? Then,
Yeah. Well, thank you for those reflections, Polly. And, adolescence clearly, as a CE of that word, a period of time, and with the T of that word, a person, um, you know, is really important to identify what it's all about for many, many reasons. I mean, one, in the pandemic, if you are an adolescent listening to Polly and me, you may say, well, what can I do to actually optimize how I make it through this pandemic, not just survive, but as we say, thrive too. If you're a parent of an adolescent, what we're about to say, has, some very practical applications and certainly implications for how you parent an adolescent. But in addition, it turns out how you actually are yourself in the world. So let's just start maybe with a definition. Like we can define the mind now, we can also define adolescence. So when I was training in pediatrics, adolescence was equated with puberty, which is, the physiological development of sexual maturation, right? And you could measure it, and we had all sorts of scales you could do. And, so that let's just identify some misunderstandings. Some people call them myths about adolescence. So the first is that adolescence is not the same as puberty. There is a big overlap in timing, but you can have a child who has precocious puberty, that is early sexual maturation, but is not entering adolescence. And likewise, you can have an adolescent with delayed puberty who has started adolescence, even though they're not sexually maturing. So while they usually go along together, they're not the same thing. So that kind of shocks people. The second kind of myth, just to identify, and you can see this. I remember when our two kids, were, going through their adolescence, and before, when I had been in pediatrics and then moved over to child and adolescent psychiatry after adult psychiatry, our friends would say, "Oh my God, they're going to be teenagers soon. This is going to be terrible. Why don't we just freeze them and then wake them up?" When it's stuff like this. They were, parents were like spreading these visions of this, terrifying, terrifying period. And they would say things like, "Let's just get it through as fast as possible." So that's the second myth. So the first is adolescence is not the same as puberty. The second myth is adolescence is a horrible period of time. Just get through it as fast as possible. It turns out it doesn't have to be a horrible period of time. And number two, part of this second myth, is that actually, no, you don't get through it as fast as possible. In fact, as you'll see, there are elements of it that you should hold on to for the rest of your life if you actually want to have a good adult life. So it's the opposite of it's horrible and go through it fast. The third myth is that adolescence as a period of time is the same as teenage years. And that's not true. Right. It can happen a little bit before the teenage years, and it certainly extends way beyond, your 20th birthday. So it's not the same as teens, even though sometimes people use those terms as a writer,
right.
The teenage brain or whatever, but we really mean the adolescent brain. And the final myth, just to say, is that, people will say, well, this adolescent period, it's when teenagers should just have nothing to do with adults. They should become independent of adults. And that's not true. They really do need adults in their lives, right? They really do need adults in their lives. So to say that, oh yeah, pushing against all adults is a healthy thing to do is actually not true. Right. So with those myths kind of clarified, let's get into what adolescence is. So, in child and adolescent psychiatry, we had the opportunity as a field to do something that had never been done before, which, happened in a number of centers. One of them was the National Institute of Mental Health with the work of Jay Giedd, Giedd, and the other was at our institution, UCLA, studying, especially Elizabeth Sewell's work, studying changes in the adolescent brain. So they began, and this is also the work of Mirella DiPreto. We ran a program called the Center for Culture, Brain, and Development, and part of our studies were to study preteens and how the brain of kids without any kind of issues going on, just volunteers, and then follow them into their adulthood. And so we now have the data that we didn't have before of structural and functional changes in the, let's just say the typical person's brain from being a kid, let's say 5, to being, an adult, let's say 35. And now we have some statements we can make about that. And my son actually was doing an internship with me and, was able to have his brain scanned as part of the study and was a part of the whole, stuff. And in fact, Elizabeth Sewell and I and Alex Siegel, whose music is great, you should listen to it. This is before he declared he was a musician. But anyway, you'll see his brain in this chapter we wrote about the adolescent brain. He was an adolescent when he wrote with us. So it was fun because, involving adolescents in their own adolescent progress is essential. And so when I was reading all the brain studies that I could find at the time for this book, Brainstorm, I have a little bit of an addiction, I'll just have to confess to, which is I kind of love acronyms, and some people love them and some people hate them. So my apologies to you if you hate them. But again, every book I've written in this one little room here. But the acronym that popped up as I was reading all this brain research was the word essence. So that adolescents have an ES, an emotional spark. Then the next part of essence is SE, a social engagement. The next part of essence is N, novelty seeking. And the third is creative exploration. And if you just focus in as a parent, or if you're an adolescent listening, to these 4 fundamental pillars of the adolescent period, it all begins to make sense. So as we get into the essence of adolescence in detail, let's just say that what the brain studies found correlates with what parents have known forever when they're not lost in these myths. And actually, from the adolescent experience from the inside out, really allows them to clarify what's going on. So let's just summarize those brain findings very briefly and say that the mind, yes, is more than the brain for sure. It's fully embodied. So it involves literally the organ called your heart, as well as the organ called your brain. It involves the organ called your intestines. It involves your muscles, your whole body. But then it involves your relational fields, the connections you have with your caregivers, with your siblings, with your neighbors, with your peers, with your friends, with your teachers, with the society, with social media, with everything. There's a relational set of fields, which are basically patterns of energy and information sharing, as well as what's embodied. So the brain is really important, but it's not the whole story. But when you look at what makes a child different from an adolescent, even independent of puberty, because of course sexual maturation is leading to changes in levels of hormones and stuff, which is another myth. People say adolescence is all about raging hormones. Well, there's no such thing as raging hormones. Just ask any hormone specialist and endocrinologist, no such thing. And the changes we see, of course, are related to physiological things, but it's not from hormones. What we think is going on actually is the brain, instead of in the first dozen years of life, when a child is dependent on adults and has a brain that's accumulating more and more connections among the basic cells called neurons, that sponge-like absorption of how things are and the creating more and more intricate connections. Once adolescence begins, independent of puberty, sexual maturation, the brain begins to remodel itself. So for the most part, it was not doing this in the first dozen years of life. It's just accumulating more and more, learning, soaking in like a sponge my experiences. Now I shape the connections in my brain. But now when adolescence begins, what the brain studies showed, which surprised everybody, nobody expected this to be the case. The brain starts to whittle down the connections it set up in the first dozen years of life. Some by genes, some by experience, the first dozen years of life. But now it's like if you're in a garden, it's pruning away some of the branches, pruning away even some of the trees. It's getting rid of what are called synaptic connections and even neurons. And as it's doing this pruning, it's getting ready basically to specialize, to become more differentiated inside the brain. And then that's the beginning of adolescence and middle of adolescence. Then as it's a use it or lose it principle, which I always tell adolescents when I work with them, if you only want your right hand, which is doing a mouse on a computer game, to be the part of your brain that's activated, just do that. Don't play musical instruments. Don't talk to your friends. Just do your game. And then that's going to be your super activated. And I have nothing against games, but do lots of different things, right? So now you've got this pruning, but in the middle to late adolescence, you have a second process that fills out what we mean by remodeling, is you're now going to lay down something called myelin, myelin. And myelin, when it's laid down it's a sheath that for given neurons that are connected to each other, it makes the speed of conduction about 100 times faster. And the resting period between firings of these neural connections, 30 times shorter. So 30 times 100 is 3,000. So when you've laid down myelin, you've taken the remaining neurons and their connections, and you've made them 3,000 times more effective. So this is huge. So essentially what you're doing with brain remodeling, pruning and myelination, is you're increasing differentiation with pruning and then linkage with myelin formation. And that makes the brain more integrated. So a more integrated brain allows you to be a more happier, a more thriving, a more resilient person. So the overall purpose and power of adolescent brain remodeling is to make more integration, which is a really good thing. And you can influence it, for example, by meditating. Meditating actually increases integration in the brain. So in Brainstorm, there are these gray pages on what you could do, but there are certain things you can highlight. So when we go through the essence, then we're going to draw on this remodeling of the brain to really understand, why do kids have a more of an emotional spark, which is basically passion? Why do they have, social engagement, which is basically collaboration? Why do they have novelty seeking? And what does that really imply? Why do they have creative exploration? And as we go through each of them, we'll refer to this remodeling brain and the certain anatomical structures, because that affects subjective experience. It affects consciousness. It affects information processing. It affects self-organization. And now with the pandemic, especially, as we'll see, it really, in a way, goes against what this adolescent brain remodeling is trying to achieve.
Right.
That's the big challenge.
I mean, as you were saying this, what's interesting to me is that I knew some of that. I certainly hadn't narrated it like you narrated it. I knew there was a remodeling. I knew some of the myelination things. But being a developmentalist, what I do know about adolescence that often gets de-emphasized is that there is identity formation, and there's the development of inductive and deductive reasoning, so that you can work on your own thoughts and feelings. You begin to have the impression that you actually are inventing or creating yourself. And then there's a certain point at which maybe you overdo the importance of that. But in any case, it is actually the time when that identity sense gets formed. And I've often, I don't work with adolescents in therapy. I mean, I have with late adolescents, but mostly it's parents that I will see. But I have said, that identity that you form in late adolescence, when you say, I'm this kind of person, or this is the kind of person I'll always be, or I'll never be like this again. I remember when my son was a skateboarder, and he was like, no, all of my life I will be a skateboarder. I love skateboarding so much, and this is who I am. And, that identity stamp does stay with adults. And so if you think that you're smart, or you're fat, or you're slow, or you're a good person or not a good person in that late adolescent time, that imprint stays with you all of your life. I mean, you may argue with it, you may transcend it, you may grow way beyond it, but yet something in you is going to snap back and say, oh, yeah, I really am like this. And to me, that was an interesting thing about adolescence from like in a Piagetian formulation. It's where formal thought operations come into being. And so you can operate on your own experiences in a way you could not as a child. And I was just thinking how that aligns well with what you're saying about the brain, because the differentiation and then the speed of connection also go with this idea that you can now work with your identity and have an identity in a way that you hadn't previously. And that really has nothing to do with hormones. I mean,
exactly. Well, exactly. And, this beautiful work by a researcher named Susan Harter, Harter, which just really resonates with what you're saying, Polly, where it's like, essentially in early adolescence, the adolescent is acting in very different ways with different social groups, or with their peers, or, with their parents or siblings. And then in middle adolescence, they continue to do that, but now they're aware of it.
Yes.
Taking these forms of saying, oh my God, well, when I'm with the band group, I act this way, but when I was with the chess club, I act that way. And they're so different. And look, I was acting this way with that other group, but they don't know what to do with it. And then how they come to resolve those differentiated selves in Harter's work, is a predictor of mental health. And if you can't find some way of saying, I realize as a skateboarder, I can be this way, but I'm also an intellectual this way. So I'm not going to lose my skateboarding thing. I'm going to find a way to skateboard my way as I become a professor. So, something like that, as you integrate all that into your life without losing it. But it's so
he ended up being a data analyst, computer programmer. He's a senior data analyst, and he's an engineer basically, but an engineer with a great interest in artificial intelligence. So I don't know.
Skateboard to work?
He still skateboards.
Yay!
And but he didn't for a while because he became a climber, which is where a lot of the skateboarders go. So he can't quite climb now that he has a kid of his own. He can't climb like he used to. Mm-hmm. So, but he took out that skateboard and he was skateboarding around, and even took his son in his arms for a short, swish on the skateboard, which did not look good to me in the video, but
But,
anyway,
these things that happen to us, around, in our childhood, and even after, how we resolve them, how it works it out. It's, you're mentioning someone who's a climber. Sadly, a patient I was seeing who wrote a book about her therapy with me, which ended up being all about the death of her brother, who was a climber, who fell off of a mountain, and then what the family's response was to his terrible death. And she was really close to him, and he was, so important in her life. And so she does the work in therapy, but she also is a writer and a comedian. And so he ended up writing an entire book about this experience, and now it's an HBO special. And I just watched the special the other night, so it's very alive, about climbers, but also just about, how it's exactly what you're saying, the identity that we have, or the fracturing of that identity based on losses that are unresolved, and the way people handle them really can shape you for a long, long time. And therapy, can be an opportunity to do that. And, even in the Brainstorm book, I put a whole section in on attachment, so that the adolescent, because I wrote it for adolescents to read themselves, as well as parents of adolescents. And when you go through the essence, the emotional spark part, I mean, if you say, well, why do you even have adolescence? And a colleague of mine, Barbara Natterson Horowitz, with her colleague, she wrote this beautiful book called Wildhood, which is about adolescence in non-human beings. And many, many, many species have this period that is itself an important way where the adolescent being is changing, different from a child, in the way it's childhood dependency, adult responsibility. It's this transition that is very important in and of itself. Back in the old days, like 150 years ago, we used to have an adolescence that was just a few years long. But now we have one that's like over a dozen years in modern culture. And that's a whole fascinating thing unto itself. But the bottom line of this period is, if you think about it, you're in a very familiar situation living at home. Nature needs you when you become mature to mix it up with people who are not genetically so closely related to you. Yeah. So nature's got to do something. So the comfortable place you're getting nice oatmeal breakfasts, is not going to keep you a prisoner at home. So this helped Caroline, my wife, Caroline Welch, and I, to figure out, this is why our teenagers are acting this way. Nature needs them to get out of the house. So that's for each of the four of the emotional, for the essence that we're about to talk about. The reason nature is remodeling and creating these things is to get you out of the house. That's always the answer. So the first one is emotional spark. The adolescent brain is more emotional, and we could go through the anatomy of it to show how why they say that. But we know that as adults, when you go to in the old days, when you go to a restaurant and you're sitting at a table full of adults that are staid and having their conversations, and then there's a table full of adolescents, like, who's having more intense experiences? Laughing, crying, screaming? The adolescents are. So the first thing to say about that is, this increased emotionality is a kind of passion. And the downside of is it can make life feel really uncertain because your emotions are huge, like big waves on the shore, and no one taught you how to surf yet. So they can flood you for sure. And what we want to do is find the upside. So people learn how to ride the wave of their emotions so that instead of squashing them down or feeling terrified of them, you learn how to live a full, impassioned life and hold on to that for the rest of your life. You hold on to that passion because a lot of adults, we've kind of cut it out. So that's the ES of emotional spark. The SE is that adolescents are driven to be with their peers much more than their parents. And this pushing away from parents for us as parents can feel so painful. You take it so personally. And I write in the Brainstorm book when my daughter, our second, was getting ready to leave for college, she was going to have a big goodbye party, and I was so excited. She goes, "You're not invited. It's just my friends coming over to say goodbye." I'm going, "Really?" She goes, "Really?" It's like, oh, and so that social engagement, the reason to get out of the house. The downside is adolescents can cave into peer pressure to gain membership, but sometimes give up morality. So that's a serious problem, potential problem. The upside is they're learning, as you said, Polly, they're learning skills as well as identity that will last the rest of their life. So that's like huge. And now with the pandemic, of course, passions can't be activated. I have a cousin who's, an actor who's applying for college, so her main thing was building up to her huge presence in the theater program in her high school. And now she's applying for college. Well, disappeared just like that. And that's where her friends were. And that's where they got together. And they were laughing and crying. They put so much time into those rehearsals that she's building up since she was in 8th grade. So it's gone. It just evaporates. So she's got to deal with the emotional spark of her passion, the collaboration of her social engagement being thwarted. So, the family's trying to figure out how to support her in keeping physically distanced, but socially connected as best as can. The third thing is novelty seeking. And there's two aspects of it that really should be just said straight. There's a shift in the brain in dopamine levels, and dopamine is a neurotransmitter that's involved in the reward circuitry. What has been found in adolescence is the release levels are much, much higher. So when you do something that is, quote, rewarding, which we'll define in a moment, you just get a bigger bang out of it. But then, this is more controversial, the part I'm about to say, some people say the baseline levels of dopamine are lower. If they're way too low, you get really out of sorts and bored and depressed. But then if you could do something to activate them. So one of the main things that releases dopamine is novelty, new things, right? Scary things, dangerous things, drugs of addiction, behaviors of addiction. Anything that has the word addiction to it, it activates the dopamine system. So this is the reason, among many things, why adolescents are more prone to get addicted to something. If they're ever going to get addicted to alcohol or drugs or smoking or whatever, it's going to happen during adolescence because this dopamine change is a big deal. The second thing that people need to know about, which is really has a weird scientific name, but I couldn't think of a more user-friendly one, so I just used the science name. It's called hyper-rational thinking. And people may hear that and go, "I think those scientists are wrong." What do you mean? Adolescents are not hyper-rational, they're hypo-rational. But here's the reasoning. And this is a sad story to tell, but my favorite professor, psychoanalyst, was killed, Bob Stoller.
Bob Stoller, yeah. I know him,
by an adolescent driving about 100 miles an hour on a surface street.
Yeah, I remember,
And that young man, unfortunately, had gotten in a crash 2 months earlier. And his parents just bought him another sports car. And when Bob died, when our son was just under 2, I just started being the training director in child and adolescent psychiatry. I thought, if there's anything I could ever do to inform that poor 19-year-old who now lives the rest of his life knowing he killed someone, and all of us who lost Bob professionally and personally, he was a dear mentor of mine, but also his family, obviously a horrible, horrible, horrible situation. I thought if there could be anything to happen. So in looking into why do adolescents have a 2 to 3 times more likely experience of permanent physical damage or death due to what an adolescent did, I thought, wouldn't that be an amazing thing to impact? So I was researching all this stuff, that is, reading the research that existed, and this hyper-rational thing came up. Here's the hyper-rational thing. It goes like this. Well, imagine that kid driving a second time in 2 months, 100 miles an hour. So he would go, this is the hyper-rational thinking. If I drive this new car really, really fast, it'll be incredibly fun. My friends will think I'm so cool, and I'll have an amazing story to tell the rest of my life that I, went, 3 times the speed limit. It's 35 miles an hour. He's going 100 miles an hour, right? It'll be amazing. Okay, I crashed the car 2 months ago, but I survived. And what's the chance of something bad happening? Maybe it's 30%. But if you ask me, Polly, what's the most likely outcome? I know that 70% is higher than 30%. So I'm going to answer you, the most likely outcome is it'll be fine and it'll be fun. And my friends will think I'm cool, which is true, actually. 70 is greater than 30. Maybe even there's a 90% chance they'll do fine. Adolescents actually overestimate danger. They just don't care about it. This is like, you can't just tell them it's dangerous. They know it's dangerous.
Yeah, right.
They're just focusing on the positive. So that's the hyper-rational word, which sounds so counterintuitive, that they reason 70% is greater than 30, so I'm going to do it. So this is now, you have hyper-rational thinking plus the dopamine issue. So this is why this danger is there. So the novelty seeking is to get you out of the house, to have the courage to get out of the house. That's what novelty seeking is, courage. But the downside is all these dangerous things they do because they don't think before they act, or they just think about the positive. And the upside, though, is you have to take a risk. You learn by risk taking. So it's a tough time. And I remember when our kids, it's hard. So I talk to teens directly about being in touch with their heart, being in touch with their gut, because I think the heart and gut would have told that young man, this is just my wish, would have told that man when he was at 19-year-old, he gets in his car, he says, his brain and his head says, this will be fine. 70% is greater than 30%, but his heart says, oh, this doesn't feel right. His gut says, this isn't about the cop telling me don't go so fast next time, or my mommy telling me don't do it. It's my gut is saying something feels wrong. I don't know what that feeling is about, but I'm not driving 100 miles an hour. Bob would still be alive. So that's the novelty seeking. And I can do that. Let me just finish the last one. The creative exploration is that, the adolescent brain in its remodeling needs to imagine a world that could be to get out of the familiar house. But the downside is, instead of in the first dozen years of life when you're just soaking in the world as it is, now the adolescent brain, with all those processes you beautifully described, thinking about who am I, what is going on in life, reflecting existentially, what is my existence all about? Adolescents can now start imagining how the world could be and even how the world should be. And then they look at how the world is and the world we adults are handing them. And they get despairing, disillusioned, depressed, disgusted, and in all these ways, understandably, given what the world is, they go, what have you done? I mean, I think Greta Thunberg is a great example of an adolescent who's standing up saying to the UN and saying to the EU, I don't understand. The house is burning and you're just doing business as usual. What is with that? So that's an adolescent brain. And if you look at the major achievements in technology, in science, in art, in music, it's happening with adolescent minds. Even if you think about the greatest notions that Albert Einstein had, were all done in his mid-20s. He was still an adolescent, right? So this is where we need to see adolescents as the hope for the future, and that supporting their creative exploration, basically imagination. The downside is you can feel despairing, but the upside is you can actually create the solutions for some of the world's most pressing problems. So for me, the essence of adolescence is, not only going to help adolescents, it's going to help the world. And if you as an adult are listening to this, I just want to say, if you just stick with the brain, if you said, what do we know about what you should do with your brain as an adult to keep it healthy and strong throughout the lifespan? And my mom is 91, and she's got an incredible mind, an incredible focus of her attention. This is pay attention. And she has all four of these things. She has passion, the emotional spark. She has social engagement. She's in this study group that she meets with hundreds of people. It's unbelievable, called Plato. So emotional spark is the passion. Social engagement, she collaborates with people and is connected to people. Novelty seeking, every 12-week session, they have something new they're studying. History, politics, science. I mean, I went to a class with my mom on time in the brain. It was unbelievable. Now she does poetry. She's reading stuff she did a whole thing on mindfulness meditation. I mean, I learned so much from my mom. It's incredible. So she's got the novelty seeking and creative exploration. She's constantly doing stuff. So when our kids get together with her, they say, how does grandma do that at 90? Have a mind so sharp? Well, she's kept her essence alive. And that's what the research on the brain actually shows. Those four things: have passion in your life, emotional spark, connect with other people, social engagement, and be in nature too. Novelty seeking, do new things, creative explorations, always be trying out new ways of living your life. That's going to keep your brain young. I don't think it'll keep it Eisendrath, but it'll definitely keep it.
Oh, very nice. Well, that it all makes sense. It all makes tremendous sense. And of course, when I was teaching, adolescent development, I did use David Elkind a lot, who was at that point very popular. And basically, some of the things that you're saying when he talked about what was called the imaginary audience, where you imagine everyone seeing you, and they sort of the sense that while problems may apply to other people, they won't apply to you. It's that hyper rationality thing that the adolescent does of figuring out why, even though it seemed to apply to everyone, that smoking was a problem, it won't apply to me because I figured out something so it won't apply to me. And also that sense of risk taking, again, can be connected to I'm the exceptional one who's not going to die from the ice climbing. But you're right about all of these qualities of the adolescent mind that are admirable for the rest of life. And yet they're coming into being with all this strength all at once. And now I want to kind of shift into the situation that we're in with this, shutdown and the confinement at home, and then the closing down of public venues, of concerts and clubs and lots of places that adolescents would go to express their passion, their creativity, get together in their social environments and so on, are not available. And then in addition, and this is what I see in Vermont here, we don't have, by the way, complete shutdown of the schools, thank goodness. And we haven't had a really very difficult number of cases or, altogether, it's been really pretty light here. But even with the school systems that we have right now, where sometimes the kids are in school and sometimes they're at home, they're on various combinations and different schools are doing different things. What I hear from parents especially is, first of all, the kind of angst about identity. Like, I don't know, it's like the adolescent staying at home. I don't know if my body is good enough, even though this person might be lifting weights or running all the time, I don't think I'm attractive, or I don't know if anybody will like me. And then also, like you said with your cousin, people that have prepared to do certain things creatively, and now those things have evaporated. They're not able to do them. Whereas somebody, say, who's going into nursing, I know someone whose daughter is going to the University of Vermont in nursing, and she's a freshman, and she's able to go. And those classes are actually happening. But somebody else who's in theater, they can't, and for
Right.
various reasons, because the nurses are needed, but the theater people are not, I think is sort of the logic of that. So, what happens to the kids who are, particularly where I feel it starts to get acute right now, are the kids that are 14 and older. The younger ones, I think, still can sometimes adapt to being at home. They can also be happy enough to be on social media or to do whatever they're doing out in hiking in the woods. But the older adolescents, being absent from their peers and also not being able to carry out their creative dreams in going away to college or in perhaps, some of them are also in college and things have evaporated. What do you recommend? How do you think about parenting, at this moment where also the parents, some parents have several children at home, all at once. And here in Vermont also, a certain portion of the population here has never engaged with computers. Even though laptops may be given to the kids so that they can do the work from school, their parents have never used computers. Their parents are farmers or they're mechanics, and they don't know anything about that kind of learning. And so then the child feels isolated, the adolescent, feels especially isolated because the family doesn't know how to help. They don't know immediately how to engage with all of these new and different ways that they're supposed to go to school, and they're not with their peers. So, how do you think about all of this in this time that we're in?
Yeah, well, those are all, questions that could take days and days to respond to. So I'll just say some very general things that, yes, I completely agree with you. These are really, really challenging times. And just to have the sense of, resilience as a parent is an important place to start. So, we did a whole series of things for resilience building in medical first responders, to teach them how to do, I call it 3-pillar mind practice, where you yourself, as they say in an airplane, need to put the oxygen mask on first before you help your kids.
Mhm.
So you got to make sure you have this presence of mind. So the 3-pillar mind training for you is, teaching you to focus attention. So this podcast is pay attention. Research shows that's really important. But then to also set the second pillar is open awareness. And that's to have this more spacious sense. So that if you picture, like the mind is like a cup, if you will, and a stressor like the pandemic is like a tablespoon of salt. If your cup of consciousness is the size of an espresso cup, that tablespoon of salt will make it way too salty for you to stay with the experience. So you want to expand it to like 100 gallons kind of thing. So that's open awareness. And then to build kindness toward yourself, kindness with patience and compassion towards others as well. And so when you do this 3-pillar practice, this is a way of you building your inner resilience. That's the first thing that we should remember always to say, no matter what the challenge is with your kid. And I certainly, have experienced this, when I was in pediatrics. If the parents didn't have that kind of resilience with a child with a medical problem, everything fell apart. But if they could bring that kind of, let's just simply summarize all that with the word presence. If they could give, Caroline's book is called The Gift of Presence. If they can give the gift of presence to themselves, then that's actually the heart of what's called secure attachment. So whatever's going to happen in this pandemic, and it looks like it'll go on for another year, not to freak people out, and here in Los Angeles, we're going into almost total shutdown.
I know.
So this will probably not the shutdown, but this state of pre-vaccine freedom, if you will, or post-vaccine freedom is not going to happen for a year. So we're facing a lot of difficulties. So what I try to offer to schools here, because I teach at schools in our local area, is to start with your own resilience with 3-pillar practice. We offer for free, in our website, drdansiegel.com, you can do this thing called the Wheel of Awareness. And parents have come back and reported that it's been really helpful to them to focus attention, open awareness, and build this kindness that the wheel does. So that's number one. Number two, you're talking about 14 and over. I completely agree with you. If you're a kid, like our next door neighbor kids are younger than that, they're kind of doing okay hanging out with their parents who have the flexibility to work from home, and then they're at home. And one of the schools is really great at doing on-screen learning. The other's not so great. So it's a little different, but they're young. For the older kids, it's absolutely what you're saying, Polly. If you think about the emotional spark, social engagement, novelty seeking, creative exploration, it's all, let's use the word challenged rather than thwarted. Let's use the word challenge. So let's find creative ways to maintain the emotional spark. So maybe it's going to be, and I've got David Rock. I've got this thing called the Healthy Mind Platter, where you can identify 7 things that should be on the daily activity of your adolescent. And this is in the Brainstorm book too. And these 7 things are research proven things that if you do them with the focus of your attention, you actually will make your life healthier and happier. So that's kind of cool that you have science that's showing this. But there are things like focusing attention on one thing at a time. If your particular child, teenager, needs to take 10 minutes of focus and 5 minutes for walking around, great. Let them really tune into what their body is telling them. But focus time without all the distractions of gadgets is really important. So that's one of those times. Another time is giving them time to have nothing they're doing. Downtime is really important for the person. And if we just look at the brain, it lets the brain recalibrate itself during the day. So you don't have to be a taskmaster saying you're always focusing. No, let it be a concentrated focus, even if it's just 10 minutes, and then some downtime where there's nothing planned. The third kind of time, and these are all ways of helping with exactly what you're saying, is have playtime, time to goof around and have fun. And this can be on the screen or on the phone, where kids are encouraged to connect with each other, even if they're physically distanced, and have fun, right? Because people can find that inner resilience. So playtime, really important. That's the third kind of time. Fourth time is physical movement, moving time. Move the body. I mean, you may not have a walking desk, but walk around. If you're on a computer, take it around. Get on the phone. Keep your body, keep your body moving, because the more we sit still, we don't live this embodied way of being in the world. So that's the fourth kind of time. I'm trying to make sure I get each one. The fifth kind of time is time in nature. Now, some people are living in the middle of the city, so it's going to be hard, but even just looking up at the sky, looking at a tree, in Vermont, there's a lot of nature around. Being in nature, incredibly important. So connect with nature, but also in this connecting time, can make sure you connect with people too. So that's the fifth kind of time. The sixth one is something you and I are very familiar with, time in, which is literally teaching your adolescent, even if it's just 3 minutes a day, you want to move to 12 minutes a day. That's what the research shows is important, but start slow. Time to reflect inwardly. And there's so many apps now that are really cool to do it. I won't name them for fear I'm going to leave some out, but just go to mindfulness apps. And this 3-pillar practice is basically mindfulness plus compassion training, essentially. And your adolescent can be doing these things. So that's time in, and doing them every day is better than just waiting once a month and doing it. It's like brushing your teeth, mindfulness, taking time in, or reflection or meditation. This is like brushing your mind, and, it's like mental floss, and then the final thing is sleep time. Now, I know people are having COVID sleep, we're having a hard time because these are not only politically hard times, but obviously with the pandemic, people are losing their lives and livelihoods, and the brain is on a constant state of alert for danger. And these are scary times. in addition to social injustice, it's being realized there's a lot of pandemics. 4 pandemics are happening, right? It's the viral pandemic, that's 1. But there's the pandemic of social injustice, that's 2. There's the pandemic of the environment being destroyed, that's 3. The 4th pandemic is the pandemic of misinformation. And if you haven't watched the documentary called Social Dilemma,
right?
Watch that and you'll see where we're polarizing ourselves, because we're clustering in these little pools of misinformation that just keep on reinforcing themselves. Just watch that documentary, or watch the documentary or read the book Merchants of Doubt, where we're filled with misinformation. So this is the 4th pandemic. So
I want to say that there is a 5th pandemic also. Yes, another one.
Which is that?
Well, Carl Pillemer, who's at Cornell, has been doing research on estrangement from family. And his book is called Fault Lines, and it's about the fracturing of families and what to do about that. And he's done a comprehensive long-term study. Roughly 65 million Americans are estranged from family, either children estranged from their parents, grown children estranged from their parents, or estranged from siblings, or estranged from close relatives. And many of these things are the result of polarizations in families about political issues, about environmental issues. So the issue also of not being connected to family members, and he then interviews a sample of people who have become estranged from a close family member. And he calls it a pandemic because it's so many people, and because very few people have been reporting on the degree of estrangement. And of course, estrangement, again, like social isolation, means you're cut off from the people you identify with. And he goes into at length, he's a sociologist, about how even though we may not think that families are that important because we've lost so many traditions, but the fact is people do identify with their families all of their lives. And people who are estranged often feel very ashamed. So they won't even let other people know, which makes them even more sort of suffering from their estrangement. So that's
now, what's
another.
His name again, Polly? What's his name?
It's Pillemer. I think it's Pillemer. And I hope to interview him. I've been trying to get in touch. And the book, which I think is a great title, is Fault Lines.
And does he call it a pandemic of estrangement, or a pandemic of isolation or disconnection? What is the word he uses?
He calls it a pandemic of estrangement.
Of estrangement.
Family estrangement.
Wow.
And so where people are estranged from members of their immediate family, and it may not even be talking about it to other people.
Wow.
Because they're ashamed of it as well.
Now, is that happening in more than the United States?
I'm sure it is, but he's reporting on a study he did, a national study he did. And I when I say I'm sure it did, I said that too quick. I would assume it would not be happening so much in Asia.
Yeah.
I would assume in Asia, because often identity is associated more with the family or the group than with the individual.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I would assume that it wouldn't be at these numbers in Asia, but that it might be similar in Canada or in England, where there are the similar kinds of themes that we have in America about, valuing our individual identity. Yeah. And then there have been these political polarizations that make it difficult for family members to relate to each other and to work through differences that might in the past have not been so disturbing, to your family membership.
Right, exactly.
So there's that going on as well, which is,
Well, so that's, that's so great. So it's for sure an epidemic.
Yeah.
Of estrangement, even if it's not a pandemic, which is like around the globe, it's certainly an epidemic. And that reminds me of the fellow who used to be the Surgeon General, who wrote that beautiful book on loneliness, Oh, God,
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I
what's
can't remember it.
called? Is it called Alone, or what was the name of
Well, there are a number. There's Bowling Alone. There's something.
there's that
There's
one,
another. There was
yeah,
several.
Bowling on, but
Several.
this
There
was
was.
one that just came out. Anyway,
Oh,
but
it
there's
just
like,
came
there
out.
isn't,
Okay.
what's that?
I said, oh, I didn't know it just came out.
It
Yeah.
just came out.
So,
It's called it's basically, it's about the epidemic, at least in the United States,
uh,
of loneliness and
yeah,
isolation.
yeah,
And that
yeah.
would go along with Pillimer's work. Well,
Right.
that's a very important thing. And the thing I want to end with sleep
Mm,
is just to say we need to prioritize it. It's a time when the brain cleans up all the
yeah.
inevitable toxins that are produced during the day, during the waking hours. So really making sure your adolescent is getting anywhere between 8 and 10 hours of sleep is really what we need, not the 6 and 5 that people are getting. And because if we don't get enough sleep, we're going to have difficulty paying attention.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to have difficulty remembering. We're going to have
Right.
difficulty regulating our emotions. And we're going to even have difficulty regulating our metabolism of food. So our insulin metabolism gets off. So we're more likely to get overweight and even be vulnerable to diabetes. And we're even more likely to have inflammation, which can lead to things like dementia.
Yeah.
So in all of these ways, sleep, 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 so important. So if you just take these 7 things and start to work with the essence with your adolescents, you can read Brainstorm and you'll see the wheel there, but you also go through each of the 4 of the essence aspects. I think we can approach this period of the pandemic with resilience. I really do. And I don't want to say I'm not being a Pollyanna, but
Right.
I really think we can. And so in a way, the disruption, in a community that I'm working with now, what we're saying is that the disruption of the pandemic is kind of, we call it PEP, it's actually an opportunity of the personal exploration of planetary possibility. So that the disruption of the pandemic is a moment that's actually an invitation to think, the way we were living with the idea of a totally isolated, separate self, this self that only lives in the body, or the mind that's just from the brain, is actually maybe not really a complete truth. And then in fact, maybe it's an illusion in E.O. Wilson's terms, or Einstein called it a delusion an optical delusion of consciousness. So we have an opportunity to think about what you might consider an integrated identity. Me plus we is mui, that we don't go all the way to just collectivistic, but we watch out for our individualism in the United States, where there's more depression, anxiety, substance abuse, domestic violence, and suicide now, rising with the pandemic. So then how can we actually have a way to bring some clarity to all of that and create an integrated way of living, which would say, I am a me in a body, but I'm also a we in my relationship. So the fun word we have is mui. And that's how we would like to thank you for having we on here. Muy
Well,
bien.
yeah, muy bien. Yes,
Yeah.
thank you so much. It's really, I think it's very helpful. I think it will increase resilience to hear what you have to say. And it's been also fun just to connect with you and see you walking there. And that's lovely. Yes. And so thank you so much for your work, and
Thank you.
continue. And I hope to see you again sometime in person. Yes.
That'd be a pleasure. I would
Yes.
love that, Polly. Great
Thank
to
you
see
so
you.
much.
Best to you and to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.